You know that gut-wrenching moment when the very child you raised, sacrificed for, and even paid half her wedding expenses decides to turn the spotlight on you, not with gratitude, but with humiliation? That was me. Richard Thompson, on what should have been the proudest day of my life. Picture this, a stunning ballroom filled with crystal chandeliers, 200 elegantly dressed guests, laughter echoing off the walls. My daughter Rachel, in her white gown, takes the microphone. I braced myself for a heartfelt thank you, maybe even a kind word about the years I worked myself to the bone so she could have every opportunity. Instead, she smirked and said, "Let's talk about my dad for a minute. He's going through a late life crisis, trying to play entrepreneur at 60. The room erupted. People doubled over with laughter, even her new husband Jake. Servers struggled not to smile. My cheeks burned while I sat frozen, mocked as the delusional old man who should have retired quietly. None of them, not even my own daughter, had any idea who I really was or what I had built in silence. What happened next flipped the entire wedding upside down, because among those laughing was one man who knew the truth, mattered Jake's powerful boss. And when he stood up, the room that had been roaring with ridicule fell into a stunned, breathless silence. Stay with me, because what unfolded in the next few minutes turned my daughter's wedding from my most humiliating moment into the sweetest, most shocking vindication of my life. The laughter still rang in my ears as I sat at the long head table, the polished silverware gleaming under the bright chandeliers. The sound of it was not warm or shared, not the kind of laughter that welcomes you in. It was sharp, careless, and it rolled through the ballroom like a tide that refused to stop. I sat still, hands folded, willing myself to breathe as my daughter held the microphone in her white-gloved hands, her smile stretching wider each time another guest chuckled. I should have been proud. This was her wedding day. The hall was filled with roses, the linens pressed to perfection, the music soft but lively. 200 guests sat in rows of carefully decorated tables. I had paid for half of it, choosing centerpieces, approving menus, and making sure Rachel had the day she dreamed of. Yet instead of a word of grat, it stung in a way I cannot fully describe. A father spends his life teaching his child to walk tall, to believe in herself, to value honesty and courage. In return, he does not expect glory, only respect. Respect is a quiet thing. It does not need speeches or trophies. It shows itself in tone and patience, in a willingness to remember who carried you when you were too small to walk. On that night in that crowded ballroom, I felt all of that erased in a single sweep of laughter. Rachel's new husband Jake stood beside her with a grin stretched across his face. He joined the room in their amusement, his hand lightly resting on her back as though he approved of the joke. Servers carried trays of champagne and ducked their heads to hide their smiles. I stared at the tablecloth, tracing the embroidery with my eyes, willing myself not to get up, not to walk out into the night and leave them all to their own noise. The temptation was strong. The doors were closed. My dignity was even closer to shattering. But then I lifted my eyes and noticed him. At table 6, not far from the stage, sat Robert Miller, senior executive at Sterling Technologies. He was Jake's boss, a man I had met only briefly the night before at the rehearsal dinner. He had shaken my hand, polite and professional, with that air of someone who carries decisions on his shoulders every day. Tonight, his gaze did not wander like the others. He was not laughing. He was watching me. Not unkindly, not with pity, but with recognition, as if he understood more than he cared to say. That look steadied me. It reminded me that silence has power if you know when to hold it and when to let it go. I raised my water glass, took a slow sip, and placed it back on the linen. Let them laugh. Let them make their little speeches. I had promised Rachel I would not speak of business tonight. She had begged me, "Please, Dad, just let it be my day. No stories about your work. Do not embarrass us." I had agreed, and I intended to keep that promise. What no one in that ballroom knew, not even my daughter, was that the man they mocked as a delusional dreamer had spent years carrying more responsibility than most of them would ever imagine. They saw only the surface, the gray hair, the 60 years etched on my face, the father who no longer belonged in the center of the story. They did not know the long days, the quiet victories, or the weight of choices that kept other families employed. And so, they laughed. I could have walked away. Perhaps I should have. But something inside me insisted that leaving would give their ridicule a permanence it did not deserve. If a man has carried silence for years, he can carry it 10 minutes longer. That was the thought that anchored me to my chair. I folded my hands. I watched the crowd, and I waited. And then slowly the mood in the room began to shift. It was not because of me. It was because Robert Miller stood. He did not rush, did not call for attention, but the room noticed him anyway. He placed his napkin carefully on the table and looked toward the stage, his expression thoughtful. My daughter was still smiling, flushed with the joy of applause, but I saw the way her eyes flicked toward him, unsure for the first time all evening. I cannot explain the relief I felt at that moment. It was as if the burden I had carried alone had suddenly been seen by another pair of eyes, someone who understood that behind every easy joke there can be a wound, and behind every wound there can be a truth that demands to be spoken. I did not know what he would say. I only knew that the silence I had guarded so carefully was about to end, and it would not be by my hand. I stayed seated calm on the surface, though my heart beat with the slow, steady rhythm of a man who knows the tide is turning. The ballroom was no longer just laughter. It was waiting uncertain on the edge of something it had not expected, and for the first time that night, I was no longer the one under the spotlight. When Robert Miller rose from his chair and the room shifted into uneasy silence, my own mind drifted to the path that had brought me here. For most of my life, there had been nothing glamorous about the work I did. I was a man of ledgers and schedules, not headlines or applause. My name had hung on a small brass plate outside an operations office, and for 30 years I moved through hallways that smelled of paper and coffee and long hours. There were meetings at dawn, audits that stretched into midnight, and vendors who needed steady hands when their own plans fell apart. I was the one who kept things from collapsing, not the one who appeared in glossy magazines. Then came the day when the company downsized. The polite words were restructuring, efficiency, new direction. What they meant was that older employees with steady paychecks were more costly than younger ones with bright smiles and lower salaries. After decades of loyalty, my desk was cleared and I walked out of that building with a cardboard box and a heart that felt strangely hollow. A man who has spent his life fixing systems does not simply forget how to work. But I found myself staring at the walls of a small apartment, wondering if perhaps my best years had already been used up. It was in that hollow time that the idea of RT Holdings was born. There was no fanfare, no grand office with polished wood. My first desk sat in a rented strip mall unit between a shoe repair shop and a place that sold discount eyeglasses. The paint was chipped and the carpet thin, but the rent was low and the phone line worked. I had no investors at the start, only a belief that 30 years of experience were worth more than a handshake and a gold watch at retirement. I began by calling old contacts, not to ask for favors, but to listen. Listening had always been the skill no one noticed, but everyone needed. One of those calls led me to a small logistics software company gasping for air. Their books were tangled, their clients restless, and their staff uncertain. Most people saw a failure waiting to close its doors. I saw a patient with a pulse. I could not do it alone. That was when I met Sam Price, a retired banker with a reputation for careful bets. He had capital, but no interest in running another office. I had knowledge, but no funds to risk. Together, we formed a partnership. His money kept the lights on, and mine kept the gears turning. We renegotiated contracts, repaired client trust. And within a year, the company was not only alive, but earning enough to pay back his investment with interest. That success opened doors to other opportunities. I didn't chase headlines. I chased problems that needed solving. One deal led to another, and soon a regional investment fund asked me to manage operations in a merger with Sterling Technologies. They wanted a man who had lived through broken lines and failing systems, not a young star with theories and bright speeches. I was the practical choice, the man who could hold pieces together until the glue set. The fund held the controlling stake. RT Holdings carried a minority position, and I carried the responsibility. Even then, I kept my name from press releases. It was not pride I sought, but peace. I had seen what happens when men chase applause and lose sight of the work itself. I wanted no part of that. I told Rachel only that I was doing consulting. She never asked further. When she did comment, it was with the tone of a daughter humoring her father's hobby. I let it pass because a father sometimes chooses peace over pride. What she never realized was that behind the quiet word consulting stood contracts, payrolls, and decisions that affected hundreds of families. My life became early mornings walking factory floors and late nights poring over spreadsheets, not because I wanted to prove anything to the world, but because work itself is its own form of dignity. I wore modest suits, drove an old car, and kept my head down. I wanted the freedom to build without the noise of judgment. What I built was not an empire of glamour, but a framework of stability companies that found their footing again under steady guidance. As the years passed, I learned that silence can be mistaken for emptiness, and humility can be mistaken for weakness. Yet I did not correct Rachel when she rolled her eyes at my stories, or changed the subject when I mentioned a new client. To her, I was a man playing at business because he was too restless to retire. To me, I was simply doing what I had always done, only now with the independence to decide my own course. That was the history that lived quietly behind my calm face in the ballroom. They saw only an aging man humiliated by laughter. What they could not see was the long road that had shaped me the nights when I stared down failure and refused to let it take what I had left. Robert Miller had recognized something of it enough to know that respect was due, and as he cleared his throat to speak to the crowd, I sat still with the knowledge that the truth I had carried alone was about to find its way into the open. Rachel never knew the full story of RT Holdings, or the long nights I spent in silence over spreadsheets and contracts. What she knew was the father who had once tucked her into bed, the man who made sure her college tuition was covered, and the quiet figure who showed up at family gatherings with steady patience. Yet somewhere along her journey into adulthood, she began to treat me not as the man who had built the ground beneath her feet, but as a figure from an earlier chapter, a relic she could pat on the shoulder while she walked on to something brighter. She forgot that fathers like mothers are not meant to be set aside like an old chair in a garage. At dinners, she would smile and change the subject if I mentioned a project. "Dad, you should enjoy retirement," she would say, as though relaxation were a prescription I had refused to take. I would nod and let her words float by, not because I agreed, but because I did not want to create conflict. I thought my silence was a gift of peace. To her, it was confirmation that she was right, that I had nothing important to add. When she and Jake announced the wedding date, I offered to help in the only way I knew how. I said I would cover part of the expenses, and I did so without hesitation. She accepted the checks and signed the invoices, but there was no invitation to give an opinion on flowers or music. I became the quiet financier, useful for my wallet, but not for my presence. At the rehearsal dinner, she pulled me aside. "Please keep the business stories to a minimum tomorrow," she said, with a smile that carried no warmth. "Jake's colleagues will be there." I told her I would not embarrass her. She kissed my cheek, relieved, and went back to her friends. That evening, I walked past the hotel bar and heard her voice again. She was laughing with bridesmaids, telling them how her father might try to pitch someone at the wedding. The laughter echoed through the hall as I paused near the door. She thought I would embarrass her with ambition. I stood there for a moment, letting the carpet absorb my weight, and then I walked on without entering. A father can forgive careless words, but sometimes those words leave a mark that does not fade quickly. I decided that night I would keep my promise. I would sit through the ceremony, smile during the photographs, and remain quiet at the reception. I would not speak of contracts or clients. I would not mention the companies that bore my fingerprints, though not my name. I would be a background figure at her celebration because I believed that was what love required. A father does not steal attention from his daughter on her wedding day, but I had not expected the maid of honor to turn my restraint into a stage performance. She began her toast with sweet memories of childhood sleepovers and college adventures. Then she turned her eyes sweeping toward me. "And of course, we have Rachel's dad," she said, "who at 60 discovered startup dreams." The guests chuckled and some clapped. Rachel laughed loudly and placed her hand on Jake's arm. I sat still, my smile practiced while the joke continued. When Rachel herself took the microphone, I thought perhaps she would balance the mockery with gratitude. Instead, she repeated the lines with greater confidence. "We love him," she said, "but some dreams really do have expiration dates." The laughter rose again, and I felt each sound like a pin against my skin. I knew then that this was not about protecting her wedding from embarrassment. It was about erasing me, reducing me to a figure of comedy for the benefit of her new colleagues and her ambitious young husband. I kept my expression calm, but my mind raced. Years of plant closures and staff meetings had trained me to absorb insult without flinching. Yet this was different. This was not a vendor raising his voice or a partner dismissing a suggestion. This was my daughter standing before 200 people and deciding her father's life was a punchline. I pushed my chair back slightly, ready to stand and leave. I would walk into the lobby, let the noise fade behind me, and breathe until it was time to return for the cake. There is dignity in knowing when to remove yourself from cruelty. But before I could rise, a shadow crossed the table. Robert Miller stood there with a folded napkin in his hand, his eyes steady and unreadable. "Mr. Thompson," he said quietly, "could I have a word with you?" I followed him to a corner near a wooden column where the band had stacked extra cables. The music softened behind us as if the room itself knew to listen. He wasted no time with pleasantries. "You are with RT Holdings," he said. I did not answer. I simply met his gaze. He lowered his voice. "We closed the integration outline last quarter. Your operational notes came through under R. Thompson. That would be you." I gave a single nod. His shoulders eased, then tightened again as he glanced back toward the head table. "What is happening in there is not right," he said. "It is not my place to scold a family at their own wedding, but it is my place to correct the record when a man who holds my company steady is being treated as if he were nothing." He looked at me waiting. He wanted to know if I would allow him to speak. I said quietly, "Keep it about respect, not about me." He inclined his head. "That is what I intend." Then he walked back toward the stage as I returned to my chair. 200 guests still laughed and clinked glasses, unaware that the air in the room was about to change. Robert Miller's steps back toward the head table carried the weight of a decision. I sat down, careful to steady my breathing as the maid of honor returned to her seat, proud of her performance. The room was still warm with laughter, the kind that lingers even when the joke has ended. Rachel's cheeks glowed with triumph, certain that she had charmed the crowd. She had no idea the ground beneath her was already shifting. Robert reached the microphone with the ease of a man who had spoken in boardrooms and conference halls, but rarely at weddings. He waited until the chatter softened, then thanked the band for their music and the staff for their service. The crowd quieted, drawn by the authority in his tone. Then he smiled at the couple and offered polite praise for the ceremony and the beauty of the evening. For a moment it seemed he would return to his seat with nothing more than pleasantries. Instead, he paused as though considering whether to step further. He cleared his throat and spoke again. "Tonight is about love," he said, "and about the people who make love possible. Not only the couple, but also the parents who labor quietly for years so that nights like this can exist." His eyes passed over the guests before settling near me. "Respect," he continued, "is the foundation of a family and also the foundation of a company. I hope we all remember the difference between a joke that lightens the room and an insult that wounds it." The room stilled. Glasses stopped clinking and whispers faded. He did not raise his voice, but the firmness in it carried across every table. Rachel shifted on her feet, glancing quickly at Jake. The maid of honor lowered her gaze to her plate. Robert offered no names, revealed no titles, and gave no explanations, but everyone felt the rebuke in his words. It was subtle enough to keep the evening intact, yet strong enough to turn the laughter sour in the mouths of those who had joined it. When he handed the microphone back to the band, there was no applause, only a polite murmur, and the shuffle of guests returning to conversations that sounded thinner than before. The band began to play again, though the music could not fully cover the new tension in the air. People glanced toward me, then quickly away. Others kept their eyes on their plates as though silence could erase what had just been said. Jake rose from his chair and made his way over to me, his smile tight and nervous. "Dad," he said, trying to keep his voice light, "I hope you know it was just humor that got a little out of hand." "No harm meant." He looked toward Robert, who was now seated again, and then leaned closer. "Everything is good with the project, right?" The panic flickered in his eyes as he asked. I only nodded, unwilling to ease his discomfort with easy assurances. The news began to spread in small ripples. A bridesmaid who worked in procurement at Sterling had heard the name R. Thompson in meetings months earlier. She remembered operational notes signed with that initial and whispered to the man beside her. By the time dessert was served, 6 or 7 guests knew the connection, and their hushed conversations created a quiet circle of awareness around the head table. They did not announce it, but they no longer looked at me with the same careless amusement. For my part, I remained seated, hands calm on the tablecloth, as if nothing had changed. Yet I could feel the weight of the room shift. The laughter that had burned against my skin was gone, replaced by a new caution. I had not spoken a word, but Robert's short address had broken the easy cruelty that had filled the hall. The maid of honor did not approach me again. Rachel carried on with her duties as a bride, smiling for photographs and greeting guests. But her laughter rang thinner now, as though she sensed that something had slipped from her control. Jake tried to recover with cheerful banter, yet each time he looked toward his boss, his voice faltered. The night did not end in a dramatic unveiling or a sudden reversal. Instead, it turned on quiet glances, on the subtle way people chose their words more carefully, and on the recognition that what had seemed like harmless fun was nothing of the sort. I let the moment pass without adding to it. A father does not need to shout to make his presence known. Sometimes he only needs to sit still until the noise fades and the truth begins to speak for itself. Robert's words lingered in the air long after the band struck up its next song. I sat with my hands folded outwardly calm, but inside I felt the weight of what had just happened. I had not asked him to defend me, yet he had chosen to, and in doing so, he shifted the balance of the evening. The sting of humiliation had eased, replaced with something quieter but stronger. The knowledge that at least one man in that room saw me clearly. When the music carried on and the guests began their chatter again, Robert returned to his table, but soon rose once more, this time with more purpose. He crossed the room with deliberate steps and stopped near me. His voice was low-pitched for me alone. "Mr. Thompson, may I speak with you in private?" I rose and followed him toward the corner of the hall where the wood columns met and the band had stacked their spare cables. There he wasted no time. "You are with RT Holdings," he said, eyes steady. He was not asking, not truly. He already knew. I did not answer at once. Years of keeping my profile quiet had taught me the value of silence. He leaned in slightly. "We closed the integration outline last quarter. Your operational notes came through under R. Thompson. That was you." I gave a slow nod, no more than that. He exhaled, his shoulders relaxing before tightening again. He knew what it meant. He had put together what others in that room had not even considered. He glanced back toward the tables, then back at me. "I do not often comment on family matters," he said, "but what happened tonight is not right. I cannot stand by while the man who steadies my company is mocked as if he were a hobbyist with nothing to show for himself." He studied me, his eyes asking the question he did not voice. Would I permit him to speak further, to lay out the truth in front of all those gathered? I met his gaze and chose my words carefully. "Keep it about respect, not about me." He gave a short nod, the kind of acknowledgement between men who understand boundaries. "That is what I intended," he replied. There was no need to explain more. He already knew that my work had touched his world directly. He knew that my role was not some small advisory position, but one of influence decisions, and long hours spent stitching together systems so that his company could function. In that moment, we shared a quiet recognition, two men bound not by ceremony or family ties, but by the shared knowledge of what it takes to keep a business alive. I returned to my seat, the clink of glasses and hum of voices surrounding me once again. Robert walked toward the stage with measured steps. The guests were unaware of the conversation that had just passed, but they would feel the results soon enough. I could sense the anticipation building even before he opened his mouth, as though the room itself knew that something was about to shift once more. It struck me then that what had started as an evening of humiliation was becoming something else entirely. The people who had laughed without thought were about to learn that the man they dismissed had been carrying responsibilities far beyond their understanding. I had not needed to demand recognition. Robert had seen enough to know that respect must be restored, and he was prepared to act. As he took the microphone again, I settled back in my chair, my heart steady, my face calm. Whatever words he chose, they would be his own. I had made my peace with silence, but he had decided silence was no longer acceptable, and so the truth that had been mine alone was about to find its way into the open, carried not by me, but by the man whose livelihood had already been touched by my hand. Robert reached the microphone with a steady hand, and though the music had just paused for a break, he commanded the room without raising his voice. He began simply thanking the band for their fine playing and the staff for their hard work. The crowd gave a polite ripple of applause. Then he turned slightly toward the couple and lifted his glass. To Rachel and Jake, he said warmly, "A beautiful night and a bright future." For a moment, it seemed he might end there, just another toast from a guest of importance. But his tone shifted. "There is one more thank you I must offer," he said, and the guests leaned forward curious. He spoke of parents, not in cliches, but with weight. He talked about the unseen labor of years, the countless ways mothers and fathers sacrifice quietly so that their children may have moments like this. He said, "Respect is the cornerstone of a family, just as it is the foundation of any company worth its name." His words hung in the air. He did not gesture toward me, did not name names, but the direction of his gaze and the firmness in his voice made his meaning clear. The laughter that had once filled the room drained away. People shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Rachel's smile froze as she clutched her bouquet a little too tightly. The maid of honor stared at her napkin, wishing she could disappear into it. Robert did not dwell or scold. He ended with a gentle reminder. "Tonight is about joy," he said, "and joy is strongest when it is joined with respect." Then he handed the microphone back to the band and returned to his seat. The effect was immediate. The musicians began to play again, but the tone of the room had changed. Conversations resumed, yet they were quieter, more restrained, as though everyone was measuring their words. Guests who had laughed the hardest now avoided my eyes. Others looked at me with a new hesitance, as if unsure how to approach. The sting of mockery had been replaced by an uneasy silence, and that silence spoke louder than any joke. Jake noticed it too. He slipped from Rachel's side and came over to me, a smile stretched too tight across his face. "Dad," he said, "it was all in good fun. You know how these things get. No harm intended." He lowered his voice and asked quickly if everything was fine with Robert, if the project was still on track. There was panic in his eyes, the fear of a man who realized that the night's entertainment might have consequences reaching into his professional life. I offered no comfort, only a small nod that told him nothing. He retreated with a nervous laugh that fooled no one. Meanwhile, whispers began to spread at the tables. A bridesmaid who worked in procurement at Sterling recalled seeing the name R. Thompson on important documents months earlier. She leaned toward her neighbor, putting two and two together. Soon a half-dozen guests had pieced the puzzle, speaking in low voices, careful not to let the secret travel too far. By the time dessert arrived, the awareness had grown to a quiet circle around the head table. Not everyone knew, but enough did, and their glances carried a new weight. I remained still, unwilling to break the calm I had chosen. My promise to Rachel not to speak of business held firm, but I could feel the shift pressing in from every direction. The people who had dismissed me as a restless old man with delusions were beginning to realize their mistake, even if they could not yet name it aloud. Rachel carried on with the duties of a bride, moving from table to table with a fixed smile. Yet her laughter no longer rang with the same careless joy. Each time her eyes flicked toward Robert, unease shadowed her expression. The maid of honor kept her distance, her earlier bravado gone. Jake tried to liven the mood with jokes, but his voice lacked conviction, faltering whenever Robert's gaze landed on him. The reception did not collapse into chaos. No dramatic announcement followed, no public reckoning. Instead, the atmosphere turned brittle, as if the walls themselves were listening. What had begun as an evening of careless mockery had become a lesson carried in the hush between conversations. I did not need to raise my voice to reclaim dignity. It was already happening, not through my words, but through the silence Robert had carved into the heart of the celebration. The air in the ballroom carried that brittle tension long after Robert returned to his seat. Guests spoke in softer tones, their eyes darting toward me before slipping away. The music played, but it did not wash away the unease. I sat there measuring my own choices, knowing that dignity is not something another person hands you, but something you hold for yourself. Eventually, the moment came when I could not remain silent forever. I rose and asked quietly for the microphone, not to make a scene, but to speak the words expected of a father at his daughter's wedding. I thanked the guests for coming, for sharing their time and presence, for making the evening what it was. I thanked the vendors, the caterers, and the band for their effort and care. I spoke briefly of love, not the kind that decorates speeches, but the kind that shows itself in small acts repeated over years. Love that pays the bills quietly, that keeps its word, that steps aside when a louder voice wants the spotlight. I did not speak of business. I didn't speak of humiliation. I spoke of the quiet strength that binds family together, even when that strength is taken for granted. The room listened. It was not applause I sought, but still they gave it. The sound was more restrained than the laughter had been, but it carried a different weight, one of recognition rather than mockery. I handed the microphone back to the band and returned to my seat. The music swelled again, this time with less strain, as if my words had steadied the rhythm of the evening. In the minutes that followed, the shift became more visible. People who had once laughed at the jokes about my so-called late-life crisis now approached me with careful words. "Thank you for everything you do," one said, squeezing my shoulder. Another murmured gratitude for the kindness of my toast. Their words were broad, covering many possible meanings, but I understood the apology hidden inside them. They had seen enough to know that what they witnessed earlier was not right, and they wished to distance themselves from it without saying so directly. When the time came for the father and daughter dance, Rachel walked toward me with a face that carried more than bridal joy. There was a flicker in her eyes, the look of someone who had been caught in a lie or who realized too late the depth of her misstep. We stepped onto the floor, the music gentle, a song her mother had once hummed while folding laundry. As we moved in time to the melody, she leaned close and whispered, "I did not know." Her words carried a tremor, part excuse and part plea. I kept my voice even. I told her that I had tried to tell her many things over the years, and she had chosen which ones to hear. She said nothing after that, and we finished the dance as though we were actors rehearsing familiar steps. When the final note faded, she slipped from my arms and returned to her guests, leaving me on the floor with memories of gentler days. I stayed a while longer, watching as the celebration found its rhythm again, though the undercurrent never returned to easy laughter. Some guests avoided me entirely, unwilling to face their own part in the mockery. Others made a point of speaking to me, offering small courtesies, as though to repair the damage done. The maid of honor kept her distance, her earlier boldness gone entirely. Jake moved through the room with forced cheer, his laughter strained whenever Robert's eyes fell on him. Shortly after 10, I decided my part in the evening was finished. I left without fanfare, stepping into the cool night where the sounds of music and chatter dulled behind me. There are nights when a father must allow the lesson to linger without forcing a conclusion. This was one of them. I had spoken enough, and the silence that followed would do the rest. The night after the wedding, I sat alone in my apartment, the quiet pressing against me like a blanket. The echoes of the ballroom had faded, yet the weight of what had happened lingered. I replayed Rachel's words in my head, the laughter of the guests, the thin smile on Jake's face, and the steady voice of Robert as he reminded the room of respect. I thought of the dance with my daughter, the way her eyes had flickered with regret, and the silence that followed her whisper. There are wounds that do not bleed but leave scars all the same, and I knew one had been carved into me that night. The days that followed were filled with reflection. At work, the phone still rang, contracts still needed signatures, and decisions still had to be made. Nothing in my professional world had shifted yet everything inside me felt altered. I realized that for years I had allowed my family to see only fragments of me, thinking humility was the same as invisibility. But humility does not require silence, and invisibility only invites dismissal. I had given them the pieces, and they had built a caricature. Rachel and Jake left for their honeymoon, their absence giving me time to weigh my next steps. I asked myself whether I had been too patient, whether my choice to remain in the shadows had contributed to the disrespect I endured. Perhaps I had mistaken sacrifice for love when what my daughter needed all along was honesty. Love without truth can twist into something unrecognizable. I walked through the offices of RT Holdings with new eyes. I watched the young analysts bent over spreadsheets, the managers in quiet conversations, the teams who trusted the name on their paychecks even if they never saw my face. They knew me as the steady hand that guided their work. They knew the hours I poured into keeping their futures secure. It struck me that strangers granted me a respect my own blood withheld. That realization carried its own ache, but it also lit a small fire inside me. When Rachel returned, the first call she made was not filled with joy from her honeymoon. Her voice carried hesitation. She asked if we could meet, her words careful, as though she feared the answer. We sat in a cafe away from family eyes, and she looked smaller than I remembered. Her confidence dimmed. She apologized, the words tumbling out quickly, a mix of shame and defensiveness. She admitted she had thought of me as a man clinging to relevance. She said she had been wrong, though she did not yet understand how wrong. I listened without interrupting. A father can forgive, but forgiveness must be anchored in truth. I told her that respect is not a decoration you bring out for special occasions. It is the thread that holds relationships together. I told her that money can pay for flowers and chandeliers, but it cannot buy the grace to treat another human being with dignity. Her eyes brimmed and she reached across the table, but I kept my hands folded. There are moments when distance teaches more than comfort. Jake called me later that week, his tone suddenly deferential. He addressed me as Mr. Thompson, his words polished with caution. He asked for advice on a project, pretending the call was casual, but I could hear the undercurrent of fear. He had realized that his new wife's father was not just an aging man with a hobby, but someone who held influence over his own career. Respect born of fear is not the same as love, yet it can still change the way a man speaks. In those days after the wedding, I felt the shift in every corner of my life. My sister, who had once teased me about chasing impossible dreams, now boasted to her friends about my work. Old acquaintances reached out with curiosity instead of dismissal. It was as if the veil had been lifted and those who had ignored me were now scrambling to adjust their vision. But the truth had not changed. I had always been the same man, the same worker, the same father. The only difference was that silence had ended, and with it came recognition. I sat each night in my apartment looking out at the city lights and thought about the choices ahead. Rachel's apology was only the beginning. Trust once broken does not heal in a single conversation. Jake's sudden politeness did not erase the memory of his laughter at my expense. But perhaps the wound could become a lesson, and perhaps the lesson could become the foundation for something new. I knew the path would not be easy, but I also knew that dignity once reclaimed cannot be surrendered again. Rachel's apology at the cafe lingered in my mind not for the words themselves, but for the uncertainty behind them. She had spoken quickly, eager to mend what she had torn. Yet apologies that rush often fail to reach the root of the wound. I carried her words with me in the days that followed, measuring their weight against the years of dismissal that had come before. Forgiveness is not a door that swings open at the first knock. It requires time, patience, and proof that the lesson has been understood. Work pressed on as it always did. I traveled for meetings, signed contracts, and spent long hours in quiet offices where the hum of machines was steadier than the voices of family. In that world, I was respected without question. My decisions were studied, my guidance sought, and my presence valued. Yet when I returned home to evenings filled with silence, I felt the gap between professional respect and personal dismissal more keenly than ever. Rachel had begun to see the truth, but one moment of regret could not erase years of disregard. We met again a week later, this time at her home. She welcomed me with a strained smile, and Jake hovered nearby, polite yet cautious. The apartment smelled faintly of new furniture and fresh paint symbols of their new beginning. Rachel tried to fill the air with light conversation, but the weight of our last meeting pressed between us. Eventually, she admitted she wanted more than an apology. She wanted to understand. She asked me to explain what I had built, how I had managed it, why I had kept it hidden. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to speak plainly. I told her about the day I left my old job, the silence of walking away with a box in my arms. I described the strip mall office, the chipped paint, and the stubborn belief that experience could still matter. I told her about Sam Price, about the first company we saved, about the nights spent repairing broken systems until they worked again. I spoke of contracts signed in quiet rooms of payrolls, protected of families who relied on decisions she had never known I was making. She listened with wide eyes, the confidence she had carried at her wedding, now replaced by humility. Jake sat silent, his expression shifting between surprise and unease. They both seemed smaller in that moment, as though realizing the scale of what they had dismissed so easily. Rachel reached for my hand, and this time I allowed it. She said she was proud, but I stopped her gently. Pride is easy after success is undeniable, I said. The harder task is respect before success is revealed. She nodded, and I could see she understood, even if the lesson stung. Family dinners changed in the weeks that followed. My sister, who had once teased me with careless remarks, now asked about my work with genuine interest. Rachel was more attentive, careful with her words, and less quick to dismiss. Jake addressed me with formal respect, calling me Mr. Thompson, his tone shaded with both fear and admiration. The dynamics had shifted, not because I demanded it, but because the truth once hidden could not be ignored any longer. Yet I remained cautious. Respect born of revelation is fragile. It can vanish if not nurtured, and it can sour if built only on fear. I made clear to Rachel that our relationship would not be mended by words alone. Actions would speak louder. I wanted honesty, not flattery, and I wanted consistency, not momentary contrition. She agreed, though I knew the true test would come with time. In private moments, I thought of her as a child again, running barefoot across the yard, clutching my hand with trust. That image had carried me through difficult years, and it had been buried under disappointment at the wedding. Now, it flickered back into view, faint but not gone. I realized then that the bond between parent and child is never truly severed. It bends, it breaks, it heals imperfectly, but it endures. The wound she inflicted on that wedding night remained, but I began to see it less as a scar and more as a lesson carved into both of us. For me, it was a reminder that silence has limits. For her, it was a revelation that respect withheld can cost more than she imagined. We were at the beginning of a new chapter, one that would require both of us to change. The slow repair between Rachel and me did not erase the memory of that wedding night, but it began to give it shape. What had once felt like a wound now became a lesson, something both of us carried and could not forget. I saw the effort she made, the small gestures of respect that replaced the eye rolls and dismissive tones. Yet even as her words grew softer, I knew we needed more than polite exchanges. A relationship cannot be rebuilt on surface courtesies alone. It requires deliberate work, a choice made again and again, and for that, I insisted we seek help. Rachel resisted at first. She said therapy was unnecessary, that we could manage as father and daughter without involving a stranger. I held firm. I told her respect was not a subject we could patch over with a few kind sentences. It was a fracture that required careful tending. Eventually she agreed, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of hope, and together we walked into the office of a family counselor. Those early sessions were awkward. Rachel spoke quickly, eager to prove she understood her mistake, while I sat quietly waiting for truth rather than performance. The counselor asked her to describe how she saw me before the wedding. Rachel admitted she thought of me as a man afraid of slowing down, chasing ventures to fill an empty life. I let her words hang in the air, not because they were easy to hear, but because honesty cannot be rushed. When it was my turn, I told her I had chosen silence too often, mistaking it for patience. That silence had given her permission to believe a false story about me. Week after week, we chipped away at the wall between us. Rachel began to realize how often she had dismissed me without thought, how her desire to shine in front of others had made her blind to the man who stood behind her. I came to see that withholding the truth about my work had not protected her as I once believed, but had deprived her of the chance to understand me as I truly was. The sessions did not erase the hurt, but they gave us tools to handle it, and slowly a new rhythm began to form. Meanwhile, Jake, though not part of the counseling, adjusted his behavior quickly. At dinners, he asked for my opinion on his projects, listening carefully, his tone measured. It was not affection, but calculation, at first a recognition that his career rested in part on my decisions. Over time, however, his questions carried more substance, and I began to see in him a reluctant respect that grew more genuine with each conversation. Outside the family, the revelation of who I was spread in quiet circles. Former acquaintances who had once spoken of my so-called hobby with amused smiles now reached out with curiosity. Some asked for guidance, others sought investment. I declined many of them, choosing instead to focus on the path I'd already set. But I noted how quickly perception could change when success became undeniable. It was both flattering and disappointing, a reminder that many only value what they can measure in dollars. The truest reward came not in recognition, but in the shift within my own family. My sister, once quick with jokes about my refusal to slow down, began to boast to her friends about my accomplishments. Rachel learned to ask questions rather than brush aside my answers. She listened when I spoke of decisions and challenges, even when the details were outside her world. Those moments gave me hope that she no longer saw me as a man chasing relevance, but as a father still worthy of her respect. The memory of that ballroom never left me, but it no longer haunted me with shame. Instead, it reminded me of the turning point it became the night when truth refused to remain hidden. I carried it with me into every counseling session, every dinner, every quiet walk through my office halls. It was the lesson carved into both of us, the lesson that silence has its limits, and that respect withheld too long can shatter what should be unbreakable. The counseling sessions brought Rachel and me to a place where we could speak without the weight of anger, but the true change revealed itself in the months that followed. 6 months after the wedding, life within our family looked different. Respect that had once been absent began to take root, though it showed itself in unexpected ways. Jake, who had once spoken to me with the careless confidence of youth, now chose his words carefully. At family dinners, he no longer addressed me with jokes about hobbies or late-life adventures. Instead, he called me Mr. Thompson, his tone measured, and he listened as if each answer carried weight. It was not lost on me that his respect was tied to the knowledge of who I was professionally, but it still marked a shift from the patronizing condescension of the past. Rachel, too, was different. She did not attempt to erase what had happened at her wedding, nor could she. But she carried herself with a humility I had not seen before. When she spoke of her work, she asked about mine as well. She listened without rolling her eyes, without shifting the subject. She did not always understand the details, but she tried, and that effort mattered more than comprehension. There was care in her tone now, a recognition that the father she had mocked was not a man playing at relevance, but someone who had quietly carried responsibility for many lives. Outside the family, the revelations from that night rippled in ways none of us had anticipated. Guests who had once laughed at Rachel's jokes began reaching out to me afterward, their words polished with apology and curiosity. 3 of them asked for consultations seeking guidance for their businesses. I accepted, selectively choosing only the projects that aligned with the principles I had built RT Holdings upon. The irony did not escape me that the very room where my dignity had been stripped away became the place where new opportunities were born. Robert Miller emerged as an unexpected ally. His decision to speak up that night had not only shifted the tone of the wedding, but also forged a bond between us. In the months that followed, he became one of my most trusted executives, a man who valued integrity over pretense. Together, we worked through complex acquisitions, late-night strategy sessions, and negotiations that demanded both patience and strength. Where others saw me as a figure to flatter, Robert saw me as a partner, and his loyalty carried weight that extended far beyond the office walls. The wider family began to adjust as well. My sister, once quick to offer her unsolicited advice about what a man my age should or should not pursue, now spoke of me with pride. She bragged to friends about her brother, the businessman who built something lasting after most people his age had settled into quiet retirement. Her words, though tinged with the sudden shift of hindsight, carried a warmth that softened some of the old wounds. Through it all, I learned to carry myself differently too. I no longer kept my work completely hidden, nor did I wear it like a medal. I spoke of it when asked, shared enough to be understood, but never sought applause. Silence had once been my shield, but now I understood it could also be mistaken for absence. I began to let my family see not just the father who provided, but the man who had built, struggled, and endured. The memory of that wedding remained sharp, but it no longer burned with humiliation. Instead, it stood as a marker, the night when truth forced its way into the open and demanded recognition. It was the night that changed how Rachel saw me, how Jake measured his words, and how the people around us reconsidered what respect really meant. 6 months later, the laughter that once stung had been replaced by careful listening, and the man they had underestimated now stood openly in the place he had earned. Time has a way of softening sharp edges, but it also has a way of preserving lessons that must never be forgotten. In the year that followed the wedding, I came to see more clearly than ever that my worth was not measured by applause or recognition, but by the steadiness of my own choices. I had built my life's second chapter on perseverance, and no laughter, no mockery could erase what was real. Yet I also realized that telling my story, even reluctantly, gave others permission to rethink what they believed about age, ambition, and dignity. Rachel and I continued our journey carefully. Therapy gave us tools, but it was daily life that did the work. She called more often, not just to share her news, but to ask about mine. She spoke with a gentleness that had been absent before, and though trust does not heal overnight, I allowed myself to meet her efforts with patience. Jake, for his part, remained respectful, his tone cautious at first, and later more sincere. It was clear that his early fear had given way to something steadier, a recognition that respect was safer and wiser than arrogance. What struck me most, however, was how the revelation at that wedding began to ripple beyond family and business. Strangers who had once seen 60 as a time for slowing down began to reach out, sharing their own stories of starting over, of building something new when the world told them they were too late. Some wrote letters, others stopped me after meetings, all carrying the same message. They said my story gave them courage. It humbled me because I had never set out to inspire anyone. I only refused to be erased. I often thought back to the moment Robert stood at that microphone, his voice steady as he reminded the room of respect. It was not his responsibility to defend me, yet he did. That act became a turning point, not just for me, but for everyone who witnessed it. He showed that truth has a way of finding its voice, even when silence feels safer. In the months that followed, he became more than a colleague. He became proof that integrity still matters in a world quick to dismiss it. There were still nights when I sat alone and replayed Rachel's words from the reception. They no longer cut with the same force, but they remained as reminders. A father can give his children everything and still be misunderstood. Yet misunderstanding does not erase love. Love endures even through disappointment, and it carries the strength to rebuild when both sides are willing. At 62, I found myself at peace with the life I had built. RT Holdings continued to grow, its foundation steady. My family, though changed by hardship, was learning to walk with greater care, to listen before laughing, to respect before dismissing. And I, once hidden behind silence, had learned that there is no shame in letting others see the full measure of who you are. When people ask me now what I took away from that night, I tell them this. Never underestimate someone who refuses to be underestimated. Age does not erase ability, mockery does not erase achievement, and silence, though powerful, must sometimes give way to truth. That wedding began as the most humiliating night of my life, but it became the turning point that gave me back my voice. I do not know what chapters remain ahead, but I know they will be written on my terms. If my daughter learned anything, I hope it is that respect cannot be postponed until success is undeniable. It must live in every word, in every act, in every bond between parent and child. That is the legacy I hope to leave not just for her, but for anyone who has ever felt dismissed for daring to dream beyond the boundaries others set for them.